brothers, raised with strict religious beliefs, accused of murdering their own family.
They were dead set on killing their parents. They would talk about it every time I saw them.
An act of violence that turned the spotlight on the bizarre hate group they joined.
Tattoos all over their body and on their foreheads and swastikas on them and everything.
What turned these little boys into these frightening young men? Tom Jarrell investigates their chilling journey. Going berserk. And the weapon teachers fear most.
Last week, some fourth graders said their teacher molested them.
More and more teachers charged with abuse that never really happened.
Student gets a low grade, so we...
Crime reported in headlines around the world. Few could comprehend the brutal and unnatural act of violence that took place in a Pennsylvania community a few weeks ago. But it was not just the grim discovery of a triple murder that was so appalling. The identity of the suspects, that was even more alarming.
They're teenage brothers accused of savagely murdering their own family. Now, what could drive two sons to such a diabolical act? Some people believe that there may be an answer in the frightening slogans tattooed on their foreheads. Well, tonight, Tom Jarrell follows the path to destruction in search of clues to a most hideous crime.
In the early morning light, a charter plane landed in central Pennsylvania. Aboard, 3 of the most wanted fugitives in the nation, brought home to face the consequences of a crime which has stunned and baffled the peaceful community of Salisbury Township. Even under extremely tight security, in handcuffs and leg irons, the 3 teenagers still seemed large and menacing. It's an appearance they carefully cultivated as they sank deeper and deeper into the neo-Nazi culture of the skinhead movement. The suspected leader of the pack, 17-year-old Brian Freeman, was formally arraigned on triple murder charges. He was followed in the procession by his cousin, 18-year-old Nelson Birdwell, charged with helping in their escape to Michigan. And finally, 16-year-old David Freeman. He too faces charges of murdering his mother, his father, and 11-year-old brother Eric. The slaughter with clubs and knives occurred inside the Freeman home on a quiet suburban street.
We've never had a murder that was this horrific before in this area at all, in Salisbury Township.
It was especially shocking because until a few years ago, the Freemans seemed like the typical family next door. Dennis Freeman, the father, worked as a school custodian. His wife, Brenda, was devoted to their 3 sons, Brian, David, and 11-year-old Eric. They followed the rigid, disciplined beliefs of the Jehovah's Witnesses. Tom Bamonte, a congregation elder, knew the Freemans for the past 20 years.
They wanted their children to grow up to have good Christian standards and good values.
As Brian and David became teenagers, a friend, Tim Peters, saw rebellion setting in.
Around 9th grade, it seemed that they were getting more away from the Jehovah religion. They wanted more freedom. They didn't want to be Jehovah Witness anymore.
Their grandfather, Nelson Birdwell Sr., who was close to them, noticed their appearance radically changed as they began challenging their strict upbringing.
I saw Brian with his hair down to his nose, combed straight down over his face to his nose with a goatee.
Relatives say Brian and David began drinking and abusing drugs, and trouble within the home soon caught the attention of the authorities. Police Chief Alan Stiles.
We've been here for some domestic situations. We've been here for some runaway reports when 2 of the sons, Brian and David, ran away a few times.
The oldest, Brian, even threatened his mother's life with a hatchet, according to the grandfather.
Brenda told me that he got her down and had a hatchet up over.
Over his mother?
Yeah. And she says, well, Brian said, if you're going to do it, just let me stand up and face you and then do it. That kind of psychologically threw him off, I guess, and when they stood up, he didn't do it. But this led to Brenda having them locked away, and it was a mental institution.
Even in the institution, Brian attacked his father during a counseling session. But after about a year, the Freeman brothers were allowed to return home. Their behavior improved, so their parents bought them a car. But the car gave them the freedom to travel and explore beliefs far beyond what their parents hoped. On some occasions, they journeyed to the rural compound of Mark Thomas, a neo-Nazi white supremacist who believes anyone who doesn't follow their beliefs must be destroyed. The Freeman brothers also found a new friend in Anthony, a veteran of the skinhead movement, who preached his views to them.
I don't believe all men are created equal. I believe there are men and there are beasts. And I believe that white Aryans are men and women, and anyone who isn't a white Aryan is a beast.
Anthony introduced the Freeman brothers into the skinhead culture, where hatred and violence are justified and death is glorified.
This is my death arm. You know, I have a lot of skulls on it. It all has to do with death, you know. And it's my way of showing that, you know, death is something that I realize and I understand.
The more they learned, the more radical they looked. Finally, with the tattoos Berserker and Sieg Heil imprinted on their foreheads.
Tattoos all over their body and on their foreheads and swastikas on them and everything.
Did their attitude change too?
Yes. It was been on ruling, you know, their group. Domination, yeah.
Fear?
Brenda, their mother, became even more alarmed and sought outside counseling. Ann Van Dyke with the state's Human Relations Commission was someone she reached out to.
There certainly appears that there was a strong conflict between the new values of these boys and the traditional values of the family.
Can you imagine what a conflict that must have set off within the family?
Well, I know it did because they told me about it. They hated their parents with a passion. I mean, a strong passion, like a burning passion, you know? They were dead set on killing their parents. I mean, that was their thing. They would talk about it every time I saw them.
It wasn't just Anthony. School chums and relatives heard the threats too, but no one took them seriously. Recently, when the parents sold the boy's car for misbehavior, again they threatened to kill their parents. Tensions got so high, Eric, their younger brother, was asked about it and told a relative, "You never know when you're going to die." Just a couple of weeks later, they did die, brutally killed around midnight, February 26th.
I'd say there was a lot of rage, certainly very brutal in the way that it was done. We believe that it started in the basement area, near the boys' bedrooms. Mrs. Freeman was murdered first. Mr. Freeman was found in the rear bedroom, which would be on the other side of the house. Eric was in his bed and was beaten while he was in bed, probably asleep.
The brothers are charged with Eric's death. He was just 11 and not part of the family conflict.
How could they have killed Eric?
I think perhaps he received a little bit better treatment. Naturally, being obedient, he would. And then I think perhaps the other thing would be that they didn't want to leave anybody behind.
Brian, David, and their cousin took a family automobile from the garage and drove away into the night. Road tripping, they called it. It would take them through 3 states.
Their trail by car went west and north into the snow-covered remote region of north-central Michigan. In this farming area, news traveled slowly. The vast space provides privacy. It was a perfect location for the 3 young men to get away, to hide away from the pressures of their hometown in Pennsylvania.
Their destination was Hope, Michigan, home of Frank and August Hess, brothers who share an interest in ice fishing and white supremacy.
I live for what I believe in, my heritage, my racial background. I want to make sure it's preserved for me and my family.
Frank Hess, earlier in the year, had met Brian Freeman at a skinhead rock concert. It was Brian who telephoned the Hess brothers from the road saying they were headed their way just a day after the murders.
Now, at this point, did either one of you or your parents know of the triple murder in Pennsylvania?
No, they didn't act out of the ordinary or anything.
They didn't seem upset? They didn't seem...
No.
Did they discuss at all their parents?
They never mentioned their parents. They said they had a house of their own.
And how did you spend your time with them?
We went ice fishing.
Just 48 hours after the crime in which they are charged had occurred, the Freemans and their cousin were socializing 550 miles away. They crashed at the half-built house of Frank Hess, sharing stories before a big swastika. The message in a movie from this video cassette cover, which was found later, is all too familiar.
I want people to know that I'm proud of my white history, my white blood.
The party was about to end. Police, following tips from the boys' travels, were closing in. The break came when the getaway car was spotted in the farmyard by Sergeant Thomas Minesberg.
When we arrived out here, we saw the vehicle there and we looked at each other and thought, you know, they're here.
Police surrounded the building and told them to surrender.
Were they surprised to see you?
I believe so.
They yelled out, "Put down your guns." And we yelled out, informed them we wasn't carrying any weapons or anything. And we pretty much just put our hands on our head, and they came out and put us on the ground and handcuffed us.
After questioning, the Hess brothers were released, and the Freeman brothers and their cousin were marched off to jail to await extradition. Back home in Pennsylvania, the small community of Salisbury Township has not put the episode behind them. Nagging worries remain. How safe is our community? How safe is our home? This chapter of violence has left them pondering an unresolved question. Was this an extreme case of rebellious teenagers who were fed up with their parents' discipline? Or were they under the influence of those who advocate hatred and violence? Friends of the Freeman brothers, including their skinhead pals, say it was all in the family.
Do the skinheads bear some responsibility for the bloodshed in that house?
I don't think so.
But you're an organization, you were a source of support for them that advocates violence, killing if necessary.
Right.
You fostered this in teenage boys who had very impressionable minds. You were their leaders. They were looking to you for advice on how to resolve a problem.
Right.
And the answer was, take a hatchet and chop them up.
We never said anything like that, and I never said anything like that.
But some of those the parents turn to for help feel differently.
What is particularly frightening about the organized hate movement is that it feeds off the natural rebellion of teenagers, but it takes that rebellion and focuses it toward hatred and violence, and says, take this rebellion and turn it into acts of violence toward people who are different from you.
Oh, Tom. Well, the big question you raise, would this have happened if these men had not been part of this hate group?
Well, Barbara, first of all, assuming they are the killers, and thus far they've only been charged, one outstanding fact is out there. They didn't kill their parents in major arguments before they sank into hate groups. After they got into hate groups, something got into them to act.
Hate groups are growing, are they not?
Absolutely, astonishingly fast. 4,000 hardcore followers of the skinheads are now out there, quadrupled in the last 7 years, and there are more hate crimes.
Why? Is it discontent in this country? Is it unemployment? Is it what?
Combination of all that. People are unhappy, competition for jobs, and basically an exciting outlet for some youngsters that see this as some new way to turn. It's a terrible thought.
And the answer is, if you're discontented, hate, and that will make it all right.
Seem to be linked.
It's a desperate story. I'm happy you brought it to us, but it's frightening.
And depressing. Thank you, Tom. Well, it was a wild week of the O.J. Simpson trial.